So I graded the project proposals. Some of you had a chance to pick them up. If not, you can try and get them after class, or you can see me in my office hours. So I tried to write some comments on all of them. So most of them were great. If you have any questions, you can't read my handwriting or something, send me email or send me my office hours. So there's only one thing that I took out for. Some people made them so they're too long. Please don't write too much stuff, because it takes a lot to read through all these. And so this was kind of like a hard warning now. For the other ones where there will also be page limits, please don't go over those page limits, you will lose points. The other thing which I didn't enforce this strictly, because maybe I didn't make it as clear, is when I have these due, I want them due at the start of class, so you're not having to come in late, or you're not having to walk at the front of the class while I'm teaching. So have them in the folder by when I start lecturing. If for some reason you can't get here on time, then let me know ahead of time, and then we can make some exceptions for that. So just, in the future, keep track of that. Just to mention a couple other things. See, I added a column onto the website, and now I'll link all of the videos for the lectures directly on here, so it's easier to go back. They were broken up because of how we processed them into 2 or 3 parts, so they're all on YouTube, so you can find them pretty easily. And then I noticed a few people were trying to leave messages in the discussion section on Canvas, so I don't regularly check that, so I haven't answered any of those questions. I set up this other discussion group it's through Google Groups. You can get to the bottom of the page, or there's a way to get to it directly. And for the people who've been posting, I reply pretty quickly on here. So it's best to ask questions on here, and I get them by email, and I reply pretty quick. As fast as I would to email generally. So any general questions is a great thing to go to. And the TAs will also reply if it's relevant to some of that stuff. All right. So today we'll be talking about finding nearest neighbors. All right. So we had this series of lectures a couple weeks ago that kind of built up to this locality-sensitive hashing, and this was kind of answering the question. I wrote these two goals up on the board of given a set of objects. Okay, and so the set may have been something like some very large set, like millions, hundreds of millions of these objects. Then n equals to like 1 million. So then to find all similar objects. All right, so we wanted to find like all pairs which are somehow close to each other under one of these notions of similarity or distance that we found, that we defined it. And so this locality-sensitive hashing showed us how we could map all the similar things into the same area and kind of automatically get things which are similar to each other. And the second question, which I claimed I kind of answered, is given still a set of these objects, of a large number of objects, and in a query object, then what we want to do is to find the closest object in the set. Okay, so we want to find the most similar object, or we want to find a set of all objects which are similar. Okay, so this you could also kind of solve with this locality-sensitive hashing, where you map all similar things together. But it could be you had a query object. This could be, say, like one of these documents we converted to a set, and then this vector, and then we could compare these vectors quickly. But it may have given back a large set of objects. It may have given back a large set of documents which were all, very similar. And we can only do this by setting some similarity threshold and say all the objects at least as similar, I want to return these, but this may have been a large set. So what we're going to talk about today is say, let's try and find the closest object, the most similar one. Okay, so this should somehow adapt to the density of the objects around it. If there are a lot of very similar things, then I should be able to find one that's very close. If there's not a lot of very similar things, then I'll find one that's not that close, but still is the most similar one. Okay, and we'll see that actually doing this exactly, finding the exact most similar one is very hard. But if we relax this definition a little bit, if we approximate this, we'll be able to do this very efficiently. And this approximation should not be that big a deal because, as we said, the choice of our distance was this modeling choice anyway. So, whether we're the closest or a little bit further away, well, that may have had more to do with the choice of the distance than it had to do with the actual actual point of view. Okay, so we're going to try and find the most similar object or the closest object under some distance. And so we'll mainly be talking about the under Euclidean distance, the L2 distance that we talked about on Monday. But I'll mention how I've used some similar distances where these techniques can apply. And in particular, we'll be looking at this at points in. We'll be looking at the Euclidean distance, which is the L2 distance we talked about. And so the input to it is going to be this set of these points where each pi is going to be in some high dimensional space. So RD, and D is going to be this large vector. This possibly large value. Okay, so now maybe at this point you're wondering, okay, where do we get data that is actually makes sense to represent as these vectors in these high dimensional spaces? Okay, so or even in like a two-dimensional space. When does this make sense? When is this the right question to ask? So I'm going to start, before I get into the techniques, I'm going to kind of give you a longer piece of motivation where you get an example of these data points, and this is the place that generates lots of these data points, and you want to find nearest neighbors often, where D is going to be equal to 128. Okay? And then after this, we'll talk about some other scenarios when this fits, when this doesn't quite fit, and when you kind of have to make some assumptions in order to get any sort of technique like this to work. Okay, so one of the main motivating, or one large motivating type of data for this are SIFT features. All right, so who's heard of a SIFT feature? So who's taken an imaging class or a computer vision class? Okay, so good. So hopefully, I'll try and describe these features. For the couple of you in the know, I'm not going to go through all of the details. As you may know, there are lots of details involved in this. But try and explain how you get to this 120 dimensional space. Okay, so SIFT features are for trying to understand images. Okay, and images are usually stored as always as a rectangle, and then the rectangle is divided up into this grid of these pixels. Okay, so each of these is a pixel, and they're, these images can have like millions of pixels. That's not uncommon, right? And so each pixel, you can think of it as having, it can have a color, and this is usually described as 3 data points, a red, green, and blue value. But let's just think about it that the picture is black and white. They'll simplify things, and each of them will have a value. So each pixel will have a value of the between black and white, between 1 and 256. Okay, so I think it is that closer to 1, it's blacker. Closer to 256, it's more white. I might have those two. So each of these pixels is going to be some value. So if this was 1,000,000, or if this was, say, 10,000 by 10,000 pixels, then I'm going to have, what is that going to be, like 100 million pixels? And so each of them has a value. This seems like a high-dimensional, maybe this is a 100 million dimensional point. Well, I've seen techniques where people look at it this way, but this is hard to get a lot of useful information out of. Okay, it's not really capturing when humans look at pictures, what they tend to see. Instead, what these image analysis techniques do is they'll say, well, this picture is actually going to be a picture of a cat, right? And so this is going to be my horrible, horrible, horrible picture of a cat, right? And so it's got some whiskers. Okay, that probably could have been a lot worse. All right, and so what's interesting about the picture of a cat? So most of the internet is actually pictures of cats, if you didn't know. So this is a good example. So what's interesting about the cat? Well, when you look at it, you see it's a cat because it's got eyes, it's got ears, it's got these whiskers, something like that. And what really stands out are kind of these corner points. Maybe the corner of the eye, or right at the tip of the ear. Or maybe there's something on the mouth where the contrast is high. Okay? And you want to try and pick out these particular points on the image, which are kind of is what are really the defining points. And you want to kind of have some sort of representative of each of these points. And each of these corresponds to 1 pixel, right? So this, I didn't draw it so pass through here, but I could draw, let's say, I drew another cell here. Then if I look at the base of the ear, and this is maybe 1 pixel, okay? And so this is kind of a corner. It's an interesting point. I want to represent this pixel as being one of the feature points on the cat. And so there are 2 steps. One is to kind of find these interesting points, and I'm going to skip that. And then for each point that's interesting, I want to get one of these SIFT features, and the SIFT feature will be a 128-dimensional vector. Okay? And so I'll kind of describe why you would get a 120-dimensional vector. Okay? So that'll be the goal of this, and then maybe briefly say why you would use nearest neighbor search to try and align these things. All right, so, okay, so if you look at, let's look at one of these, let me draw this a bit bigger. So if I look at this pixel here, let's say this pixel has a value x, right? This was a pixel value between 1 and 256, and it's going to have eight of these neighbors. Okay, so let's label these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and so for each of the neighbors, how you pick out kind of these corners is you often look at the difference in the values. This tends to be more stable under different lighting conditions, different angles. So you want to look at the difference between these 2 values. So this value x will have a value, and the neighbor 1 will have a value. So you're going to get, first you're going to get eight let's call these shift or edge values. And so these are going to be x minus the value of neighbor 1, x minus the value of neighbor 2, and x minus the value of neighbor 8. Okay, so I've got 8 values here. And this kind of tells you the change. You can think of this as these arrows coming out here. Now here, I'm having a high contrast from this pixel outside the cat to going into the cat. Maybe the background is white, the cat itself is red, or is a darker black. All right, so I'm going to have a high value going here in these directions, and I'm going to have a smaller value going in these directions. So I can think of them as these vectors, where I have longer vectors, where I have more contrast, and this kind of helps me to find an edge. Okay? And so I'm going to get 8 values here. So this is 8 values for this pixel. So SIFT stands for Scale Invariant Feature Transform, or scale. It's supposed to be scale invariant, it's supposed to be rotation invariant, and so this is 8 values, but I want to get to 128. So to do this, I want to not look at just one pixel around here, but I want to look at many different scales. So I'm going to start by looking at a scale of size 1 pixel around. So this is one scale. And I'm going to get neighbors here, but I'm going to look at, so how do I do this? So instead of looking here, I'm going to look at a neighborhood of size size 4 by 4 around here. And I'll do this for different so I'm going to have 16 squares around here, and so each vector or each pixel, which I think is interesting, is going to have a scale, a size scale associated with it, and this neighborhood will might be larger if I have a larger scale. But I'm going to look at 16 pixels in this neighborhood, or 16 neighborhoods around this pixel I think is interesting. Okay, so for each of these neighborhoods, a 4 by 4 area, I'm going to create one of these kind of edge value histograms of size 8. So I'm going to do edge values, and then I'm going to do this times 16 neighborhood. So in these 16 neighborhoods, so in each of these cells, I'm going to create one of these kind of edge directional histograms. And so I'm going to get these eight values in 16 places, and this is going to be 128, this 128 dimensional vector. Okay, so this may seem like a kind of strange way to do it. Why would you want to look at these 16 neighborhoods and different ways? Well, there's a story with this paper. This is a paper published by David Lowe, who's a computer vision guy, and it took him like many years to actually get this paper published. People thought this whole technique is kind of silly. Why would you? This histogram, edge histogram kind of made sense, but why do you pick these 16 neighborhoods? And why do you try this at different scales and stuff? And so it took him many years to get it published, and because it seems so simple, but he had really spent a lot of time thinking about this, trying out different combinations, and this really modeled what was interesting about these vectors. And now this is probably one of the most highly cited papers in the last 15 years in all of computer science. I was have like 100,000 citations, something like that. This is like one of the most used tricks. And part of it is because it does a great job of using the domain knowledge of what the modeling of the image is supposed to be. And partially because this vector, it gets this 128-dimensional vector, now maps to this point in Euclidean space. So now it's in a very easy format for us to use. And it's very convenient to think about things in Euclidean space. Now we have not just these 8 values, but we have these 8 times 16 values, these 128 values. And we can now, the right way to compare them is actually the Euclidean distance between them. But a lot of, it's very natural and that works very well. So now when you compare 2 images of cats to kind of know that they're cats, you have a bunch of these feature vectors, and you want to find very similar ones in other images. You want to say, see if there's, for these images, that these feature vectors I found, let's look in the set of a huge library of millions of these feature vectors I have, and if I match very closely to other ones that are also on pictures of cats, I probably have a cat in the image. And this works amazingly well. Yeah?
I just want to make sure I'm correct. These 128 dimensions are the pixels?
No, they're not exactly pixels. There's some kind of thing I've done on a pixel. Each of the values is the difference between 2 pixel values. Okay? So I have so I'm going to have a 16 cell neighborhood around a particular point. And for each of the neighborhoods, I'm going to create a size 8 histogram, this edge histogram that looks in these 8 different directions and looks at the differences here. So I have this kind of 8-dimensional vector here, and I do this in these 16 different neighborhoods around the point. So this 4x4 centered at the point.
Yes,
And each of them corresponds. So this is the first 8 things, this is the second 8 things, this is the third 8 things, and so on. And that's the same for every feature.
Sorry, so what's about the 1
So, what's special about it, or
how do you take 1
So it's a good question. So where this 8 came from is because you kind of have 8 neighborhood directions. Maybe you could have picked 4, but it kind of makes more sense to do 8. Why do you use 16 neighborhoods? So you have 2 in every direction. Well, you know, that was kind of some choice that he experimented with these different possible ways of doing the neighborhoods, and he found that this one worked well. You know, I don't know. If he had done just 4x4, then I would have had only a 32-dimensional vector, right? But the 16 seemed to work better. Maybe I could have had one centered here and then 8 more around the outside. You'd have 9x8, and then you would have whatever 9x8 is. That's 72 dimensions, right? So it's still some large dimension Euclidean vector.
So have you figured out where to sample these points? Because I can't imagine that you do that for every pixel in the hand.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. There's a whole other part of this, of how do you get these. Kind of what you want to do is find the points that have a high contrast. And what they do is they kind of do Gaussian blurring at various different scales of blurring. And they kind of find, after you've done that, where are the high contrast points. And by the different scales, it allows you to see image features at different sizes. And that's also kind of a heuristic process. So there's some process that picks out the points of interest, and then there's another process that creates this 120-dimensional vector out of that. So I'm not sure, is this covered in the imaging classes here, or?
Kind of sounds like marching square. Is that marching square?
No, this is not the marching squares. That's a technique for kind of finding the boundary of something. So in computer vision, there are these edge detection algorithms where you pick these 8 different directions and you look at the contrast in each of these 8 different directions, and when you can chain these together, you can get edges. There's a famous Kenny's edge detector. So all this stuff is built into MATLAB. So there's software to do this, to generate these things for you. So there's a lot of other details to go on here. The point I want to get out is this is one way where you get this high dimensional vector. And this is kind of it, and then it makes sense to find nearest neighbors in this Euclidean space, and this is a heavily used operation within a lot of these computer vision and and these imaging things. So this is the important subroutine here, but it occurs in other places as well. So I'm going to soon get to this question of how do we find these nearest neighbors, but first I kind of want to pause and say what other ways does it make sense to get these high dimensional, or maybe it doesn't need to be 120 dimensional, but a vector where Euclidean distance makes sense to measure these things. Anyone have any suggestions?
You consider weather data, then data can be considered in many terms like temperature, pressure, and these are all your dimensions.
Okay, so I've got temperature, pressure, humidity. So if I stopped here, I'd have this three-dimensional plot. Okay, so this is, okay, yeah, so.
I was going to say, don't you have to kind of scale those though? Because if they're on different scales, then you're Euclidean distance.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. So this is actually a dangerous thing. Another dangerous thing would be, say, so people, and I have something like age, weight, income, and I have these different values. All of them by themselves are these real value numbers. But when I look at the distance, I'm treating them all equally. Temperature may vary between 1 and 100, or roughly. You can say, as pressure is going to change between a value of probably 2 or 3, right? If I look at the pressure, and humidity between 1 and 100 again. Well, these are on different scales, so that means that the pressure could be a difference of 3, and this is a huge difference in pressure. But temperature difference in 3 is not a big deal. So if I don't scale these properly, then I'm not sure what the right way to compare these is. And so this is, and the same thing here with age is between 1 and 100, weight maybe between, say, 100 and 300 or something, and income, but income is like, in somewhere in the tens of thousands probably, right? And so, the income is going to be deciding all these factors because it's going to be much larger. So one option is to try and scale them in various ways so they're all on the same level. And there are various automatic ways to do this. They're all kind of dangerous. They have different problems. If you look at the most extreme and make those so you scale them so they're always within 0, 1, well then you're very sensitive to outliers. Let's say you take the mean and the standard deviation, and you make them all so they all have the same mean and the same standard deviation. Well then, everything looks the same. You're not going to find any interesting structure. You need to somehow know how to compare these if these are different sorts of values. So this is kind of a dangerous sort of thing to compare. So I just want to give you warning. So there's often not really a better way how to do it. You may want to scale them somehow under your domain knowledge of the situation, but you can get weird effects if you do this. And the different ways of scaling will give you different sorts of which things are most similar. This goes into your distance function. This is your choice of your distance function. Depends on how you scale this. What would make sense also, you could give a different idea of the so say something like the monthly weather. So I have two weather stations, and each of them I have the January average temperature. I have the February average temperature, and up to the December average temperature. Right now, all these are in the same units. So now I can compare two locations, looking at their average temperature in each month, and this is a fair comparison now. I don't have to worry about scale. Okay, it could be that there's much more fluctuation in, say, February than there is in December. But that's okay. That's kind of a feature of the data. And you want to that helps you understand. But these, I don't have to worry about the scaling and the normalizing of the parameters. So that's also fine with the SIFT features. The SIFT features are all in the same units. They're all in the difference between these two pixel values. So it's okay. All right, so I'm not saying you can't do it with this sort of data, but you need to be careful. You're making a choice in how you scale them, and that choice may have some consequences. Okay. So there are lots of other examples, but we'll see this also when we talk about PCA. That there are examples given with this sort of data, and maybe it makes sense to do it, but you just have to be careful. Okay, so how I'm going to talk about this is I'm going to start by smaller dimensions, and it turns out there are different sorts of techniques you want to use. Depends on what dimension you're in. Actually, what I'll talk about in this lecture, you could talk about over 2 full semesters. There's a lot of material just on doing nearest neighbor searching. I'm going to try and give you kind of the cream of the crop, the most important details, and not go into, and also give you an overview at the same time. Okay, so for small dimensions, let's start with d equals to 1, right? So I'm in 1 dimension. That means that, so the idea is I'm going to have a bunch of these different values, a set of these objects. And so let me draw these objects. They all lie in 1 dimension. Right, so they all lie along here. So now, how can I find, so let's say I have a query point. How can I find the nearest neighbor to this query point? So what's the right way of doing this? Okay, Nitin.
Draw 2 rays, one on the both sides, and then.
So I've got a lot of these points. So the trick we're going to use is we're going to do some pre-processing of our data. We're going to spend some time to store this data in a special way so I can answer this query efficiently. This is a query we're going to ask a lot. We're going to have lots of these queries. I'm going to build up a dictionary or a large data set. And this is going to be fairly static. There are some update issues, but in general, you can just occasionally rebuild the data structure if your data updates too much. So I'm going to spend some time to update this, to store this data in a special way so that I can quickly answer what's the nearest point to this query. So this should be something from a basic data structure class you should know how to use.
Use a tree?
A tree, good. Yeah, so you can build this binary tree on top of here. Right, so I build this binary tree, and so at each level of the tree, I should have used red here, right? Let me try again. So at each level of the tree, what I can do is I can store an interval, for instance, of where are all the points in this subtree. Okay, so now if I have this query point, which is going to be this value here, I look at this top. So at the top interval, I want to look at the 2 children, and I know that the query falls within this interval, not this one. So the closest point must be in here, right? And so then I know that it must be in this subtree, so I recursively do this. I check the query is in here. It's not in this subtree. I can ignore this. And then I look down and I can check both of these 2 points, right? So I can do this, and if I have n points, I can do this in O of log n time, right? So the height of the tree is logarithmic. I only need to just go down the tree. So this is basic Dave structures. So, you know, another insight here is that I can actually divide up this whole domain into these regions so that between these boundaries, so that if the query point falls between these two lines, this is the nearest neighbor. If it falls between these two lines, this is the nearest neighbor. Okay? And so this point is not at the center of the range, but the line is at the center of the two neighboring points. Okay? So I can think of this structure as well. I can just build, there are other ways of building a binary tree structure to do this, but you can do this, you know, fairly efficiently log n time. So now the challenge is, you know, this works great if you really have a lot of data. You want to use something called a B tree instead, which is going to store things efficiently in memory, and instead of splitting two ways, is going to split much larger way for various reasons. This will be much more efficient. But we somehow want to replicate this idea for higher dimensions. And how it works in higher dimensions kind of and what you can do depends on what the dimension of your space is. Okay? So, but this is kind of the basic idea. So we somehow want to build some sort of tree structure that we can kind of ignore whole sections of the tree based on some test. And then we can also think of dividing up the space into these regions. Okay, so now let's say for D equals 2, which is it's a small case, but it's a fairly common scenario. So there's a nice property. So now I've got points, and so this is just about the highest dimension I draw. So all my dimensions will look like, all my examples will look like they're in 2 dimensions. But this one actually works in 2D. So let's say I've got points that look like this. So now I'll talk about how to kind of replicate the tree structure later, but right now I want to say how to replicate this structure of dividing up the region. So I want to divide up this region in the same way, and so what I can do is kind of find the nearby points and draw the midpoint line between them.